So anyway, um, I'm just going to start over. Welcome and happy Valentine's Day. Um, Before we continue, we're going to look today, by the way, at the yellow wallpaper. And my purpose again in examining these other Gothic tales is to begin to familiarize yourselves with the elements of Gothic. And it really is more complex than what you might think. It isn't just dark stories set in castles, although that's part of it. Um, the important part of it is to examine some of the things that were particularly implemented by some of the women writers. Um, and we've got Du Maurier, we have the Brontes, and we're going to look at Gilman in a few minutes. And the important thing is um, the complexity of the genre. So let me review again the elements of what makes something Gothic. Uh, so you probably took notes last week, but I really think it's important to examine these complex elements of the genre. So one of the things, and we have to remember that this is romantic in nature. Therefore, the emphasis is on the feeling. We'll see in Du Maurier, we'll certainly see in Perkins, um, even in Edgar Allan Poe, that it is the feeling the author is examining. There's also an element of the medieval. And we're not talking about the setting being back 300 years. We're talking about the medieval atmosphere, which is why they're frequently set in castles or even abbeys. This is the darker side of awareness. It is also an examination of guilt, fear, and madness. And we're going to take a look later. I'm not sure I'm going to get to it today, but certainly by next week. That there's been a lot of comparison between Rebecca and Jane Eyre. And I have a couple of very interesting articles about it. But the point of examining that is that the elements make the atmosphere. As I said, there's castles and abbeys. We have often a persecuted heroine. We have ghosts and nightmares. It is the world of neurosis and morbidity. Neurosis for sure in Edgar Allan Poe. We have a tone of melancholy, anxiety ridden, sentimental love. There's a note of horror and ruins and shadows, passion and violence, also repression. Certainly see that in Du Maurier and in Perkins, Gilman Perkins. We see this the what does that say? I just hate when I write notes and can't read it. The life of feeling, curiosity, and doubt, anxiety. It's exploratory and fearful. I'm just reiterating this article that I read to you last week, but it's so important because for many years the Gothic didn't get the recognition maybe of critics. It was considered to be maybe a B level kind of work, but I think we'll see by the end of Du Maurier that it is really complex. The heroine's emotions are paramount. We're looking at the tension between violent physical effects and perplexed incomprehension. If you have already started Du Maurier, Rebecca, you are going to see that perplexed incomprehension. Same thing as in the figure in the yellow wallpaper. Let's see. I also made a mention of the Shakespearean connection, Hamlet and Macbeth particularly. Also pay attention to facial expressions. And let's see, I think, oh, the landscapes. We have to take care of the landscapes, and we see that especially in Du Maurier. We'll take a look at the connection between Du Maurier's experiences living on a place that looks a whole lot like Manderley. Visual correspondence to the inner psychological state. So the weather reflects their inner emotions. And I said the landscapes, that's important. Okay, so I hope you were those are the things that we are going to look at in our tests. So we're going to begin with just a quick examination of Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Gilman Perkins, I get that backwards every time. Her dates were 1860 to 1935. So particularly interesting is her feat in both centuries. Part of her biography is that she was married to a fellow named Gilman, and he was a young artist. Within a year, they had their first child, Catherine. Thereafter, and this is important to the story, Gilman suffered bouts of depression stemming from her desire to work as an artist and writer and advocate of women's rights, and the conflict between this desire and her more traditional role as wife and mother. How many times have we seen that at the end of the century, that people wanted to work, women, and yet they were stuck in the more traditional roles. In 1886, Gilman had what is called a breakdown, but I, I don't know that anybody really can define this concept of the nervous breakdown. I'm not even sure what that is anymore. But she was treated for hysteria by somebody, a neurologist named S. Weir Mitchell. It's the treatment that we are going to see in our character. Oh, I'm holding it in my hand. The treatment for postpartum depression. She the treatment was prescribed by this S. Weir Mitchell as rest and abstinence from work. Despite this treatment, Gilman grew worse and feared for her sanity. Whoa, that's exactly what we are seeing in the yellow wall. So she eventually separated from her husband and moved to California, where she began to publish and lecture on the economic and domestic dependence of women. That was really her forte. This is the yellow wallpaper is considered her best work. She did write a lot about the economic situation of women at the end of the 1800s. During the 1890s, Gilman published this story, The Yellow Wallpaper, based on her breakdown and the rest treatment. So I'm sure that there are people out there who have had children and who suffered postpartum depression. And if you can put yourself back in Gilman's perspective, and what we see in the yellow wallpaper is she had this very significant rest treatment prescribed by her husband, the doctor, who seems to be well-meaning. He doesn't seem to be mean, but everything was taken from her, the main character, the eye speaker. Everything, including the baby who never appears. It's being cared for by the sister of the eye speaker's husband. There's no baby. And you'll notice that the eye speaker hides her writing underneath the floorboards. She hides it from everybody because she is not supposed to be doing that. And I don't know about you, but if that were taken from me, I would definitely succumb to some level of insanity. If I didn't have I didn't have my work, which you can't see because this perspective is neat and that one isn't. Um, but it's important because what she has contributed to the world of literature is these realistic stories that deal with the unhappy situations of the everyday world. That is what makes this piece Gothic. It's the everyday unhappy situation. And in this case, it's women. So the yellow wallpaper, according to this biography, is a brilliant psychological study and its emotional intensity and introspection. And remember that it's the I speaker, and in our case, the I speaker's introspective perspective. That's a lot of perspectives and ifs. It also maintains this sustained effect of madness, loneliness, and desperation with psychological intensity. This is considered her best work. She did write in the 1890s Women and Economics, um, a major volume of social criticism. So that actually was much more her interest was um, more social works than fiction. The story is told in the first person by a young wife and mother, the who's taken the rest cure. I would have flipped. Of course, she did too. Um, the rest cure for her nerves. At the end of the 1800s, we begin to see a shift in the interest from the external to the internal. Um, Gilman's stated intent is to indict the methods of, she said this, S. Weir Mitchell, who ordered a similar cure of complete rest and abstinence from intellectual stimulation for Gilman to cure her depression and her breakdown following her own marriage and motherhood. So she was deeply conflicted. According to Gilman, this medical advice brought her nearer to the brink of utter, and this is a quote, utter mental ruin. The story is unique in Gilman's canon in not resolving happily. The narrator, according to the traditional view of wife as a dependent child, oh, we sure see that, and believes that her husband doctor knows best and sinks into horrifying insanity. So if we take a look at the story, if you just look at the story, and the appearance of the paragraphing at the beginning, her paragraphing seems pretty traditional, but if you just quickly flip to the end of the story, it's single sentences, it's exclamation points. um, Things have clearly deteriorated in her in her writing, which of course reflects her mental state, much like what we'll see in Du Maurier, and also we see in Jane Eyre. And I'm going to make references to Jane Eyre, assuming that mostly everybody has read it at some time or another. But I don't expect that you have to read the novel in order to understand what I'm saying. I'm going to make references to it, but this might be something that you could read later, but I don't insist that you read this simultaneously. It's just interesting to notice the similarities. So she begins by establishing right off the bat that they are in an estate. It's a colonial mansion, a hereditary estate. I don't know that it's a castle, but it probably has some of that atmosphere. She says in the 1, 2, 3, third paragraph, there's something queer about it. And why has it stood so long untenanted? She's setting up the mystery right off the bat. But is she able to provide the answers? No. John is practical. This is the husband, and she has complete faith in him, much like at the end of the 1800s, people were beginning to put a lot of faith in science, and he's the science guy. And so he scoffs openly at any talk of things not to be felt. So she's the absolute opposite. He's super practical. And we're going to see her feeling here in the next paragraph. Don't you hate when ads come up? Um, she says in the next paragraph, John is a physician, and perhaps I would not say it to a living soul, of course, but this is dead paper and a great relief to my mind. So he scoffs at her writing because it's not living, it's not examinable. I think I've told you this. In my college classes, I'll um, return a paper, and inevitably, someone will come up to me at the end of the class and say, I just don't see how you can grade this. It's so subjective. And I'll tell them, no, it's not. It's not subjective at all. It's objective. And that's what she's quarreling with this in her mind because the husband says this is dead paper, and yet it gives her such relief. He does not believe I am sick. Dang. And perhaps in your lifetime, you've experienced that where you can't get someone to believe that this or that is not right. And that's what she's saying. He doesn't believe her. He says that it's a nervous depression, a slight hysterical tendency. Women have often been accused of that, a slight hysterical tendency. We've seen that in other works as well. Do you remember that story, the story of an hour, Kate Chopin, where everybody's trying to kind of be careful around her because apparently she's got a heart condition. And so then when she sees her husband and perishes on the spot, they blame it on her heart rather than, and her slight hysterical tendency. She is forbidden to work. And then down towards I don't know if you have the same copy as I do, but at the bottom of the first page, there's a contrast between her feeling and science. That's the process that we're seeing. It really drives me crazy that my glasses are crooked. What happened was that my dog, Daphne, who is the namesake of this novel, popped up and hit me in the glasses and bent them. So I always look like my niece with the bent glasses. So we turn to the next page, and she talks about the setting. Remember, setting is crucial in Gothic, the most beautiful place. It is quite alone, standing well back from the road, quite 3 miles from the village. It makes me think of English places that you read about. The landscape, it's crucial. Um, there are hedges and walls and gates that lock, and lots of separate little houses for the gardeners and people. That's interesting, isn't it? I would kind of like to be there. There are greenhouses too, but they're broken, suggesting that this place, re-emphasizing what she said in the beginning, she doesn't understand why it hasn't been tenanted, lived in, and so it seems to be a little ramshackle. It's deserted. She says that spoils my ghostliness. I am afraid, and I don't care. There's something strange about the house. Next paragraph. I even said so to John one moonlight evening, but he said what I felt was a draft and shut the window. So he's completely oblivious to how important her feelings are to her, especially in this state. But John says, if I feel so, I shall neglect proper self-control. There's the contrast. But we see in this piece the emphasis on her feelings, her response to the place. A few paragraphs later, he said, we came here solely on my account. A little blame there. that I was to have perfect rest and all the air I could get. Perfect rest. That's that rest. And as I said, um, Gilman was prescribed this perfect rest, and she's taking it to task. Next paragraph. She's beginning to let out little details about the setting. It is a big, airy room, the whole floor nearly, with windows that look all ways, and air and sunshine galore. That seems pretty nice. Um, we're going to see her looking out windows. And we always know that that is symbolic for a character looking for something, seeking something. For the windows are barred for little children, and there are rings and things in the walls. And the room seems to have a mysterious purpose, doesn't it? She says that the paint and paper look as if a boys' school had used it. It is stripped off the paper in great patches all around the head of my bed. Think about it. She's able to reach back, strip off the paper, suggesting that maybe she has done it herself. She thinks perhaps this was a room where little children were housed. But there is a bit of a question here. How reliable is she, first of all? And perhaps was she the one ripping off the paper? About as far as I can reach. Well, there's the clue. It doesn't go any further than how far it is. She's early on dropping hints about her relationship with this paper. Next paragraph. They suddenly commit suicide, plunge off at dangerous angles, destroy themselves in unheard of contradictions. She's describing the paper and giving it the ability to commit suicide. Next paragraph. The color is repellent, almost revolting, a smoldering, unclean yellow, strangely faded by the slow turning sunlight. What color yellow is that, would you think? She says it's repellent. And you can think of ugly yellows. I mean, without being crude, we know a ugly yellow, especially when there's snow on the ground. I don't know how many of you were in my class about 2 semesters ago when Daphne threw up during class. But that's another repellent yellow. That's what she's trying to give to us. There comes John, and I must put this away. He hates to have me write a word. And yet the writing is what saves Gilman in real life. A few paragraphs later, but these nervous troubles are dreadfully depressing. That's her point of view. Next paragraph, John does not know how much I really suffer. He knows there is no reason to suffer, and that satisfies him. So, what was that movie star's name? I really kind of detest him for this. The guy who played the pilot, I forget his name because I can't stand him, but he berated Brooke Shields a number of years ago, 10 years ago, after she publicly admitted that she had postpartum depression. And that guy, I can't remember his name, berated her for suffering with this. And that is the way people treated postpartum depression for many, 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 many years. Next paragraph, a few paragraphs later, it is fortunate Mary is so good with the baby. Such a dear baby. But she can't even have him. Which I'm sure is contributing to the whole process. Here, remember we said that one of the elements of the Gothic is being patronized by someone else. And he says that on the next page, then he took me in his arms and called me a blessed little goose, and said he would go down cellar if I wished, and have it whitewashed into the bargain. Blessed little goose. saying. Next paragraph. It is as airy and comfortable a room as anyone need wish, and of course I would not be so silly as to make him uncomfortable just for a whim. So that is what he is suggesting is it's her own flaw. Next paragraph. Out one of the windows I can see the garden, those mysterious deep shaded arbors, the riotous old fashioned flowers and bushes and gnarly trees. So she's looking out, and there's that trope. Not only that, there's a contrast between these flowers and bushes and what she sees in that wallpaper, which she thinks is so, um, I don't know, insane that it threatens to commit suicide. It's puzzling, but there's the contrast, the real flowers and outlook. He's in the next paragraph. She's still looking out, and he says that with my imaginative power and habit of story making, a nervous weakness like mine is sure to lead to all manner of excited fancies, and that I ought to use my will and good sense to check the tendency. So I try, always seeking good sense. And there's the contrast. I think sometimes that if I were only well enough to write a little, it would relieve the press of ideas and rest me. That's the point. It's her work that would save her, as it does for Gilman, but her feelings are irrelevant to the husband. A few paragraphs later, there is a recurrent spot where the pattern lolls like a broken neck and two bulbous eyes stare at you upside down. Look at the imagery in the wallpaper, which is a direct contrast to what she actually sees outside. It has a broken net and two bulbous eyes stare at you upside down. I have to tell you that when I was a child, I would go to my grandma's house, and on the wall was paper like this. Big, fat, scary looking flowers that I saw eyes in. Makes me sound kind of nuts, but I was scared of the wallpaper too. She personifies the paper in the next paragraph. Up and down, sideways they crawl. Those absurd, unblinking eyes are everywhere. She says that they have an expression. A few paragraphs later, I used to feel, always the feelings, that if any of the other things I looked too fierce, I could always hop onto that chair and be safe. I kind of picture her hopping onto a chair, fearing as if there's a mouse in the room. Because that's what we all do. We jump on chairs when a mouse comes around. Because they turn on you. There was a mouse in my old house one time. It turned on me. It was scary. It was that big. A few paragraphs later, then the floor is scratched and gouged and splintered. The plaster itself is dug out here and there. She's telling us about some of the damage in the room, and we know eye speakers are notoriously unreliable. How is the room getting so damaged? I don't mind it a bit. She doesn't mind damage. It's just the paper that spooks her. Two paragraphs later, there comes John's sister. She, such a dear girl as she is, and so careful of me, I must not let her find me writing. Next paragraph. I verily believe she thinks it is the writing which made me sick. It's interesting, isn't it? Two paragraphs later, she's looking outside. There is one that commands the road, a lovely shaded winding road, and one that just looks off over the country. A lovely country, too, full of great elms and velvet meadows. It's peaceful outside. Inside, it's not peaceful. There's damage to the room. There's damage to the floor. The wallpaper has been torn off. She says that there's a sub-pattern in the paper. We're beginning to see some of the cracks. Next paragraph. But in the places where it isn't faded, where the sun is just so, I can see a strange, provoking, formless sort of figure that seems to sulk about being silly and conspicuous. Behind that silly and conspicuous front design. She doesn't really clarify to us what she's seeing, but it may be herself behind the silly pattern. It's a strange, provoking, formless sort of figure. Is it herself? She doesn't say, but we begin to suspect that maybe she's putting herself there. She says, 3 paragraphs later, John says, if I don't pick up faster, he shall send me to Weir Mitchell in the fall. Yikes, that's the guy with the rescuer. She says, I cry at nothing and cry most of the time. This is this pervasive depression. She says 2 paragraphs later, so I walk a little in the garden or down that lovely lane, sit on the porch under the roses, and lie down up here a good deal. What is a primary characteristic of depression? A lot of sleep. But we again see the contrast between the madness of the room and the peace and beauty of outside. She says, it dwells in my mind so. I lie here on this great immovable bed. It is nailed down. The bed is nailed to the floor. And we go back to what she said earlier on. What was this room used for? Was it used for naughty children? Or we begin to suspect that maybe they created this room for her. You nail down the bed, and there's no other furnishings in the room. So she goes back to the wallpaper. I start, we'll say, at the bottom, down in the corner, over there where it has not been touched, and I determine for the 1000th time that I will follow that pointless pattern to some sort of conclusion. I don't know if you have wallpaper in your floral wallpaper in your homes, but what she's doing is following the pattern all the way around the room, establishing what we find her doing later on, following the paper around the room. A few paragraphs later, she says, I know a little of the principle of design. I know this thing was not arranged on any laws of radiation or alteration or repetition or symmetry or anything else that I ever heard of. That's art. She's clearly got the language of art, and that's not what she's seeing in the paper. Looked at in one way, each breath stands alone. The bloated curves and flourishes, a kind of debased Romanesque with delirium tremens, go waddling up and down in isolated columns of fatuity. So she's using the language of an artist, a visual artist, that she doesn't see in the paper. So she begins to hate the paper. She calls them interminable, grotesque. And then she says, she identifies her mysterious feelings. I don't know why I should write this. I don't want to. I don't feel able. Mysterious feelings. And I know John would think it absurd. I must say what I feel and think in some ways it is such a relief. So her own art, her writing, is her salvation, but it's being taken from her. Half the time now I feel awfully lazy. I lie down ever so much. A few paragraphs later, it is getting to be a great effort for me to think straight. Just this nervous weakness, I suppose. So she's beginning to see her own disconnectedness. And we see the cause effect. Her writing's been taken from her, her art. Do you remember the poem, Aunt Jennifer's Tigers? Oh, I should have given that to you. That Aunt Jennifer had been hindered at the end of the 1800s by her marriage to her husband. And we don't think he was cruel or any, well, he might have been cruel. But her salvation is in her needlepoint. Remember needlepoint? She made these pictures of tigers who were unassaulted by any. Anyway, that's irrelevant, but it occurred to me. A few paragraphs later, he says, "No one but myself can help me out of it, that I must use my will and self control and not let any silly fancies run away with me." That's exactly what Perkins felt. There's one comfort: the baby is well and happy and does not have to occupy this nursery with the horrid wallpaper. That baby doesn't even have a name. Of course, is always a representative of how a character fits in. This baby is not relevant, certainly not relevant to the I speaker for her being able to help herself a little bit. Um, she says, behind that outside pattern with the lolling heads and the beady eyes, the dim shapes get clearer every day. A few paragraphs, and it is like a woman stooping down and creeping about behind that pattern. What? That is what we see the I speaker doing later. It's like a woman stooping down and creeping about behind that pattern. That's she almost is she's foreshadowing what is going to happen to her sanity. She says the faint figure behind seemed to shake the pattern, just as if she wanted to get out. And the husband comes in and says to her, "What is it, little girl? Oh, that is so condescending. Don't go walking about like that. You'll get cold." So we're getting a little bit of information from the conversation with the husband. Don't be walking around. You get back into bed and let me tuck you in. Science versus feelings are showed at the bottom of this paragraph, the bottom of this page. The repairs are not done at home, and I can't possibly leave town just now. Of course, if you were in any danger, I could and would, but you really are better, dear. Whether you can see it or not, I am a doctor, dear, and I know you are gaining flesh and color, and your appetite is better. I feel really much easier about you. And she's telling us on the other side that she's getting madder and madder, insaner and insaner. I don't, well, maybe it is. But it's her pathetic loneliness. "Don't weigh a bit more," said I, "nor as much, and my appetite may be better in the evening when you are here, but it is worse in the morning when you are away." She's terribly, terribly lonely. She says, "Maybe I'm better in body," but she's telling him she may not be better in feeling. She says, "Can you not trust me as a physician when I tell you so?" So that whole dependence on the science and deferring to that over her feelings are really portrayed in their interaction with each other. On the pattern like this by daylight, there's a lack of sequence, a defiance of law that is a constant irritant to a normal mind. So the wallpaper, apparently to her, doesn't have any particular artistic order. A few lines later, um, she says, "It is like a bad dream." There's the nightmares. Bad dream. She says, "There is one marked peculiarity about this paper, a thing nobody seems to notice but myself, and that is that it changes as the light changes." Well, we know what she's saying, and you probably have this in your own houses, that the light moves across a room and that it changes how you perceive the room, or in this case, the wallpaper. And the best example I can give you is um, maybe the paint color in your homes. The paint color looks different in daylight than it does in the nighttime when you flick on the lights. It does look different. Oh, I didn't realize that it was that green or brown. I think when I bought this house, the people who owned it were told by somebody, "Okay, make everything neutral, neutral, pick it neutral." So they picked a color paint. You can sort of see it back there. It's Band-Aid color. I tell my kids, I'm going to paint it eventually, but for now it's okay. But I can go incognito in my walls because I'm the same color as the walls. And I think I think that's like what the eye speaker is saying. By moonlight, the moon shines in all night where there is a moon. I wouldn't know it as the same paper. Isn't that interesting? At night, in a kind of light, in twilight, candlelight, lamplight, and worst of all, by moonlight, it becomes bars, like it, like a prison. The outside pattern, I mean, becomes like bars, and the woman behind it is as plain as can be. We wonder, what woman? And we wonder, because she's personified this paper, if she thinks she's in it, or is it a figure of her imagination? Well, it certainly is, but just don't know. She doesn't seem to know either. She says it is a very bad habit. I am convinced, for you see, I don't sleep. Again, we can understand this. If you've ever had insomnia, it can drive you crazy, literally. And you think about it. Eventually, I'm sure that for most people, insomnia passes, but it does contribute to your ability to perceive the world well. Note that the structure is beginning to deteriorate. The fact is, I'm getting a little afraid of John. He seems very queer sometimes, and even Jenny has an inexplicable look. Well, they're starting to look at her like something's not right. They're looking at her weirdly. Why? Because she's losing her grip. A few lines later, it strikes me occasionally, just as a scientific hypothesis, that perhaps it is the paper. Well, they've been talking her into, sorry, I'm trying not to sneeze, into believing that that she needs the rest cure and that her work isn't helping her. Scientific hypothesis. A few lines later, down at this about 4 paragraphs. Then she said that the paper stained everything it touched, and she had found yellow smooches on all my clothes and John's, and she wished we would be more careful. The paper's yellow. It's a weird yellow. It's it's a repugnant yellow, and she's finding it on her clothes. Foreshadowed. 2 paragraphs, 3 paragraphs later, I turned it off with a laugh. I had no intention of telling him it was because of the wallpaper. He would make fun of me. He might even want to take me away to the Weir Clinic. I don't want to leave now until I have found it out. She wants an answer about the paper. Now, her connection to this paper does not seem scientific or sane, but we can follow her deterioration. And remember that one of the characteristics of Gothic is feelings and loneliness and depression and anxiety. And this is what the eye speaker experiences. 3 paragraphs later, it is the strangest yellow, that wallpaper. It makes me think of all the yellow things I ever saw. Not beautiful ones like buttercups, but old, foul, bad yellow things. Just put that into your head, because that's the color of it. She says there's a smell in here, and it creeps all over the house. I find it hovering in the dining room, skulking in the parlor, hiding in the wall, lying in wait for me on the stairs. Well, remember that one of the other characteristics of the Gothic is things that are explainable. And if you've ever been in an old place, it can smell. It's got that musty, moldy smell. And it isn't always a healthy smell. She says, it gets into my hair. Here's the element of mystery. Even when I go to ride, if I turn my head suddenly and surprise it, there is that smell. Again, you can kind of explain the phenomenon. If you have ever used a new hair product, I used a new hair product recently, and it smells like coconut. And when I'm in the jail where there's no smells at all, except old clothes and dirty people, if I turn my head, I can smell like coconut. But that we can explain, we can understand that. Few paragraphs later, and now notice that the structure of the paragraphs is beginning to decline. It's sentence by sentence by sentence. But now I'm used to it. The only thing I can think of that it is like is the color of the paper. It's a yellow smell. Is that mold? It's foul. It's a foul smell. There is a very funny mark on this wall, low down near the map board, a streak that runs round the room. Okay, that goes back to her visualizing the woman behind the paper making rotations around the room, low down. She's hinting at something. A streak that runs round the room. It goes behind every piece of furniture except the bed. A long, straight, even smooch, as if it had been rubbed over and over. There's a madness going on behind what she's telling us. And she's not coming straight out and telling us. It's reminiscent of the guy in Telltale Heart who has this madness over the eye. There's nothing wrong with the eye, we think, but he's still obsessed with it. Round and round and round, round and round and round, it makes me dizzy. 2 paragraphs later, through watching so much at night, when it changes so, I have finally found it. What? What have you found? The front pattern does move, and no wonder the woman behind shakes it. And my copy of this, I wrote an exclamation point. Sometimes I think there are a great many women behind, and sometimes only one. And she crawls around fast, and her crawling shakes it all over. What? Who's crawling? You begin to feel her losing her ability to discern what is going on. Few paragraphs later, many paragraphs later, it is the same woman. I know, for she is always creeping, and most women do not creep by daylight. So somebody's creeping at night, around and around and around. I see her on that long shaded lane, creeping up and down. I see her in those dark grape arbors, creeping all around the garden. And we're beginning to wonder if she really is outside, or if she's looking outside. I see her all that long road under the trees, creeping along. When a carriage comes, she hides under the blackberry vines. Few lines. Next paragraph. I don't blame her a bit. It must be very humiliating to be caught creeping by daylight. She keeps using that word, creeping, creeping, creeping. I always lock the door when I creep by daylight. So nobody sees her creeping at night. And if she's going to creep, and we don't know who's creeping. It's the woman behind the wallpaper, right? And apparently that woman comes out and creeps around the room, creeps around the room, creeps around the room. But if she does it during the day, the eye speaker locks the door. She doesn't want to be seen. I often wonder if I could see her out of all the windows at once. But turn as fast as I can only see out of one at a time. That's interesting. So I'm looking out into my backyard. So if I move my head really fast, can I see both at the same time? I cannot. That's what she's saying. It's an interesting observation, kind of weird. And though I always see her, she may be able to creep faster than I can turn. I have watched her sometimes away off in the open country, creeping as fast as a cloud shadow in a high wind. So, what is a cloud shadow? What is a cloud shadow? Her imagery is becoming mysterious. If only that top pattern could be gotten off from under the under one. I mean to try it, little by little. I have found another funny thing, but I shan't tell it at this time. Well, what's the funny thing? She's peeling the paper. We've already seen her doing this behind her bed. We think it's her because it's only within her reach. So John comes in. John knows I don't sleep very well at night. For all I'm so quiet. He asked me all sorts of questions too and pretended to be very loving and kind. Condescension again. But he's treating her as if she's a child whose nerves have gotten the better of her. A few paragraphs later, that was clever, for really I wasn't alone a bit. As soon as it was moonlight, that poor thing began to crawl and shake the pattern. I got up and ran to help her. I pulled and she shook. I shook and she pulled, and before morning we had peeled off yards of that paper. As an outside observer, we can see her decline mentally, but we can almost understand what John sees. In the middle of the night, she's peeling paper. A few lines later, Jenny looked at the paper in amazement, but I told her merrily that I did it out of pure spite at the vicious thing. So Jenny comes in, and John comes in, but nobody says anything because this looks pretty kooky. A few lines later, this bedstead is fairly gnawed. So she's chewing on the bed, we think. Somebody's chewing on it. Maybe it's the woman behind the paper. I don't want to go out, she says. I don't want to have anybody come in till John comes. I want to astonish him. She's really proud of it. A few lines later, I tried to lift and push it until I was lame, and then I got so angry I bit off a little piece at the corner, but it hurts my teeth. She is biting the bed. She's chewing on it. Next paragraph. Then I peeled off all the paper I could reach, standing on the floor. It sticks horribly, and the pattern just enjoys it. All those strangled heads and bulbous eyes, when waddling fungus growths just shriek with derision. Paper again is personified. But you can almost feel it, can't you? You can almost feel her personal decline. I don't like to look out of the windows even. There are so many of those creeping women, and they creep so fast. I wonder if they all come out of that paper as I did. What? As I did. She is the woman behind the top pattern. A few lines later, I suppose I shall have to get back behind the pattern when it comes night, and that is hard. It is so pleasant to be out in this great room and creep around as I please. That word, creep, creep, creep. And now she's admitting or saying that she's creeping. Outside you have to creep on the ground, and everything is green instead of yellow. Contrast between inside and outside. And here I can creep smoothly on the floor, and my shoulder just fits in that long smooch on the wall. Isn't that pathetic? It's She's creeping, and remember the sister has seen yellow on her clothing. So why there's John at the door. It is no use, young man, you can't open it. He does call and pound, and he's crying for an axe. You can hear the hysteria. Everybody's freaking out, to use my kid's term. John dear, said I in a gentlest voice, the key is down by the front steps under a plantain leaf. She's tossed it out the window. She says, I can't. The key is down by the front door under a plantain leaf. What is the matter? He cried. For God's sake, what are you doing? I kept on creeping just the same, but I looked at him over my shoulder. He's gotten in, and he sees her creeping, creeping, creeping. So this is quite artistically created for us by Gilman, because the eye speaker has said that the woman behind the paper is doing the creeping, and now all of a sudden she admits that she's creeping. She's the creeper. I kept on creeping just the same, but I looked at him over my shoulder. Oh my gosh. I've got out at last, said I, in spite of you and Jane, and I've pulled off most of the paper, so you can't put me back. So, as if to suggest that maybe she has permanently lapsed? Now, why should that man have fainted? But he did, and right across my path by the wall, so that I had to creep over him every time. It's shocking, isn't it? But what Gilman is, she's indicting this eye speaker's place in the world. She's indicting the dependence on science over feeling. And she's indicting this rest treatment that didn't help her. So she had some kind of breakdown, as this woman has. But the brilliance of the piece is the Gothic detail. We have this setting. We have we have a creepy house that's got some sort of mysterious elements to it. We see that the paper is personified. We see that the outside reflects the inside. And we see that this is her imagination. And we see it decline. It's really very pathetic. I sometimes give this story to my jail students, and the women get it. And the men, they look at it like, why did she do that? But the women who have experienced postpartum depression understand the decline in a person who has become depressed. And in this case, like Gilman, the eye speaker actually lapses completely. So there's the madness that is also part of the Gothic element. This story was written later than Poe. Poe was in the 1840s, and this piece was written in I lost the date. It was 1890 or somewhere in there. So this is a number of years later, but we see a lot of the social elements being brought in as well. Science versus imagination, the dependence on science, the shift away from the internal to this dependent on scientific observation. So let's move to Maurier. And I want to look first at the House of Secrets, which is in the back of the book, page 392. Oh, that's right. The House of Secrets was written by du Maurier about the house where she lived. Much of her descriptions of Manderley are from Menabilly. Tell me you're not going to get that mixed up. But she describes this place in a way that is clearly autobiographical. And we'll see that as we go along, especially at the beginning when she describes the first time that she ever went to Manderley. I love that name. I may even name a dog after that. It's just so it just rolls off your tongue. At the beginning of this section, page 392, on October, November, the month escapes me, but in the West Country autumn can make herself a witch and place a spell under the walker. And therein is the mystery. And she's going to walk us through her first approach to the place and what she felt. Of course, next paragraph, I was still a newcomer to the district, a summer visitor whose people had but lately bought the old Swiss cottage, as the locals called it, a name which to us had horrid associations with an underground railway in the Finchley Road at home. We were not yet rooted. But du Maurier talks quite a bit about having been so firmly rooted in this Menabilly. We were new folk from London. So my sister and I, poring over an old guidebook, first came upon the name of Menabilly. And at the top of page 393, she makes a mention of her panting Pekingese. I thought that was funny because a lot of these authors seem to have small decorative dogs, maybe like me. Daphne's not decorative, but the little fellows surely are. Um, and just so you know, the reason that this lecture is a little delayed today is because I usually prepare the lectures on Friday and then tape them on Saturday or Sunday. But this weekend, I was at 2 dog shows. I got 3 seconds and a first. Just saying. I didn't, my dog did. Anyway, decorative dogs. Next paragraph. But let's see, on that first autumnal afternoon when the drive was new to us, it had the magic quality of a place hitherto untrodden, unexplored. I was Scott in the I was Cortez in Mexico, or possibly I was none of these things but a trespasser in time. The woods were sleeping now, but who, I wondered, had ridden through them at once? Look at the imagery and what she is seeing in the place. And it is as if she's an explorer in a brand new place. She admits that she might really just be a trespasser, but there's something really beautiful about this first exploration of Menabili. At the top of the next page, page 394, and following the moon's light, we struck through the trees and came out upon the hillside. In the distance below us stretched the sea. The sea is a factor in many Gothic stories because it's threatening and um, it's unaware of man's place in the greater scheme. It is not malevolent. Oh,